Hello friends, and welcome to a new episode of Reality Check. Our age is dominated by the ephemeral and the transient. Cultural deconstruction runs rampant, and a looming nihilism seems to engulf all meaning and existence itself. Yet, the transcendent still manages to break through. Here at Reality Check, we inquire how to conserve the real in a time of deconstruction. In a world pulsating with technological advancements and rapid change, the importance of a liberal arts education has never been more profound. It's not just about textbooks and lectures. It's a symphony of ideas, a celebration of curiosity, and an invitation to explore the world with all of its rich complexity. In short, it's about perennial truths. Whether it's philosophy, literature, history, or the arts, liberal arts provides the compass that guides us through the complex terrain of human experience. So in today's episode, we'll explore how liberal arts education fosters adaptability, nurtures a love for lifelong learning, and equips individuals with the tools to navigate the rough waters of society and learn from age-old wisdom. So our guide in today's episode on this journey will be Dr. Margarita Mooney Clayton. She's an associate professor at Princeton Theological Seminary and the founder and the executive director of Scala Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to restoring meaning and purpose in education through classical liberal arts. And as of recently, she's also a fellow at Blackfriars Hall in Oxford, where we met. So welcome, Dr. Mooney.
Thank you, Jan.
So I think we can go by first name, right? We've had many nice chats outside, so gotten to know. I had the pleasure to get to know you better upon your arrival in Oxford. So now you're back in the States. You're speaking from Princeton. So thank you for taking the time today, Margarita. So I've had a chance to look at your book a little bit more in depth after our conversation on these topics in general. And there's lots of really interesting topics in relation to liberal arts and education, the love of learning, and inciting that excitement about learning. But before we get to all of that, I'm actually just interested in how did you get to Princeton and the Theological Seminary more specifically? Can you give us a little bit of background there?
My background actually is in sociology, which I studied at Princeton University. I was probably interested in a field like sociology because I grew up really with two different cultures in my household. My father being American of Irish descent, my mother being a refugee from Cuba who came to the United States with her 13 brothers and sisters when she was in her 20s. And so I was really curious about the historical changes that had produced the Communist Revolution in Russia, and then, of course, the Communist Revolution in Cuba. And I was interested in the resilience of people in the face of darkness and power. And so I was drawn initially to the work of sociology because of its attention to culture and to national level change and comparative history. What led me eventually to the Princeton Theological Seminary was a project I did on the philosophy of social science, where a group of us were trying to reintroduce into the social sciences, which were becoming more and more empirical and empiricist, right? That the only thing we can say about reality is what we observe from an external, supposedly objective perspective. And we wanted to reintroduce concepts of virtue and the common good, not purely as something mechanical, but as something that encompassed the whole human person within an inevitable moral dimension. Sociology continued with an interpretive field, called ethnography, the kind of interviews and observations. But the interpretive lenses were always perceived to be just one or another subjective framework. So through this project is when I began to argue really that if the field of sociology cared, as I did, about resilience in the face of suffering, we had to look at the human person as having this unified material and spiritual dimension, which simply cannot be reduced to one or another kind of means and calculation. So I became frustrated in not being able to share the experiences that I was encountering that people had, experiences of forgiveness and mercy. And even that had to be translated into, well, I forgave the people who harmed me because it reduces my anxiety, as opposed to, I forgave these people because I believe that's what I'm supposed to do, whether it feels good for me or not. And so, why would an ethical decision to forgive be better than to take revenge? And there has to be some criteria outside of the psychological satisfaction to the victim to think through these ethical questions. So this work led me to now teach, instead of sociology students, I teach mostly Protestant students who are very interested in cultural questions and social change and how it impacts the life of congregations and how they can lead people and evangelize people and share the heritage of Christianity in a culture itself that has become unmoored, perhaps, from these fundamental truths about the human person and the human good. How do we communicate this meaning and purpose today in this culture?
That's really fascinating. I just had a conversation with a psychologist who basically made the same point. He said, well, if you look at the human person, and he's a practicing counselor, right? So he works with couples, and he said, well, if you just look at the person from an empirical point of view, you may think that you can actually alleviate their suffering through like material and mechanical means, and this includes your medicine, and but also, as you say, well, like forgiveness for your own good. But he says it's actually it's just too short. It's too short of a vision. As you need to look at the broad ramifications. And he actually mentioned it in couples therapy. He mentioned, well, if you want to fix a marriage, you need a reason. Why you need a reason why you even undergo all of the struggle, right? That helps you work through it, and that has to be a higher ideal. So it's really interesting that in sociology, in psychology, but then also in philosophy, we all come to the same conclusion that, well, the reality, right? We have the reality check here, so that the reality of the human person is just so much more than just the bodily dimension. So now, anyways, but you mentioned your students and their kind of rising interest in these causes as relating to their faith in the congregations. Has your experience at Princeton working with the students, teaching the students, has that been a positive one? Do you feel that they're just eating up the ideological kind of prejudices of our society, or are they actually willing to engage with all of those presuppositions from a critical point of view? What's your experience?
Well, I would say that honestly, I see a little bit of both, but following advice from more experienced colleagues who are much older than me and have lived through other kinds of cultural revolutions, the advice I was given, which does seem to work, is that if students automatically respond to a topic or a reading by positing one or another, as you put it, deconstructionist lens, that to me is incoherent, because we want to have strong moral values at the same time we want to deny that they're true. So this leads to a problem. What I try to do is I try to pull the students back to their personal interests, to what context do they see themselves living out these ideas? Because as you mentioned with your friend who's a psychologist who actually treats patients, that's very different than a psychologist who only looks at brain scans all day long.
Right.
When you have to put your ideas into practice, into a particular context, you are confronted with reality, with all of reality. And you're confronted with the fact that you can't manipulate all circumstances or change all people. So that leads to a question, maybe an uncomfortable question. Do I use my power to force people to do what I know is right, which goes against my commitment to autonomy and freedom?
Mhm.
Do I try to persuade them? And how would I persuade them? Or do I make the radical choice to live with difference and find a way to pursue my vision of the good and the true, knowing that not everybody will be persuaded, that we live in an imperfect society, yet we can still promote a vision and measure, yes, I believe, our impact without having to dominate other people who don't want to participate along the way. And I think most people want the third option. They want to believe that they have a vision that they can promote and that they can do so without the use of force and violence. And we have seen not a small number of movements employing the methods of violence. And I asked students to ponder this. I mean, it's been very apparent in the United States. And some students are quite happy to justify that. And what I do, because I'm a professor, I let them express themselves and let the students engage with that. Because if one person is justifying it, the person on the other end says, well, how do I know that's not going to come from me? Why am I not guilty of that sin, whatever it may be, right? Who decides? So this is the question I often try to get students to. Okay, if you believe that violence is justified, who has the power to decide that that gets applied to XYZ person? Who is the community that decides that? Because then they, again, and if they can get involved and see what's happened, well, the problem is that once you go down that path, you're essentially saying that whoever happens to have the power gets to decide that. And that means that, they can turn that on you, they can turn that on someone else. So I do see, in particular, after the violence that the United States has experienced, that students, at least one-on-one, will come to me after class and say, listen, I am really disturbed by the social violence, but also by what we call in the States the cancel culture, that if you ask a question or express a viewpoint that's out of line, not intending to harm people, that you can be attacked on social media, you can be doxxed, they'll put out your address. So students are genuinely afraid in the classroom. And it's not me that's making them afraid, it's other students.
Yes.
And so, again, my proposal for this, and being in a theological school has allowed me to explore this much more in depth. My two proposals to deal with the cultural difficulties we're having around deconstruction, as you put it, are theology and the arts and the Virgin Mary. Those are the two topics which seem to touch people personally and have a kind of attraction to the good that makes them want to seek the truth in a more authentic way. So what I have done is developed a class on beauty and its place in Christian formation. They're having to confront most people's understanding of beauty as something that the pleasure of beauty is purely subjective and that each work of art is its own judge. Yet at the same time, in their experience, they're actually drawn to particular forms of beauty, right? So, we walk through this. And then perhaps what has surprised me the most as a Catholic woman teaching in a Protestant theological seminary is the honest curiosity about Mary, the Mother of God. And the reactions I've gotten, the questions I've gotten, really go along two lines. One, who is this woman? Because we don't hear much about her in our churches, other than that she gave birth to Christ. Tell us more. And two, a kind of almost a stillness before the devout reverence for the Mother of God in Latin American culture, Our Lady of Guadalupe, or historically in Italian culture, or the appearances of Our Lady Wanda and Medjugorje, Fatima, just this amazement at the flocks of people who have reverence for this mother. And then, Jan, perhaps what has surprised me the most is that the Virgin Mary herself has performed miraculous interventions for some of my Protestant students without them even seeking it. She has broken through all of the ideology and all of the abstraction and has presented herself as a spiritual mother who loves them. And not only did this cause, in two cases that I've been told recently, physical healings, but the result of those physical healings was a spiritual closeness to God the Father and a gratitude for Mother Mary. So this instinctual reaction of gratitude and peace in the face of a suffering that had been healed, but still leaves a hole. Right? It's truly astounding to me. And what I've come to see is that the Virgin Mary, as she has throughout history, wants to lead people back to this fundamental unity and interior unity and a participation in the life of the Trinity, which is, of course, a unity of love of three persons. And she's communicating this in a very real way today.
And you weren't originally, you weren't kind of, I don't know, scared or hesitant to bring this up in front of, Protestant students, because I would imagine that, kind of waltzing in, talking about the Virgin Mary is not going to only get you positive feedback. So how did you even have the idea of taking that direction in a fundamentally Protestant seminary?
It happened through a class I was teaching on religion and culture amongst immigrant communities. And as part of that reading list, where we read about Italian Americans, African American slave migrants who converted to Christianity, we read about my book about Haiti and Catholics from Haiti. We read about a variety of immigrant groups to the United States. And a couple of those books, as a part of the experience of these immigrants, described the Virgin Mary as something that would gather people back together in diaspora, as somebody that would be a cause for celebration and festival. And I was very nervous, Jan, because I was expecting to get a lot of questions about these excessive devotions to Mary that must be theologically suspect. But one woman said to me, after reading Robert Orsi's Madonna of 115th Street, which is about Italian American devotion to Our Lady of Mount Carmel, she said, I didn't realize that the Virgin Mary is more powerful than the Catholic priests. And I thought to myself, as a cradle Catholic, like, there's no order of comparison here. I mean, she is head and tails above. But what moved her was the embodiment of that power of the woman, that these Italian men, including the priest, would kneel down and beg Mother Mary to have mercy on them as sinners. And the analogy to that, which she picked up on because it's so beautifully explained, is that the public authority of men in Italian society is not as powerful as the private moral authority of the Italian grandmother, who through her suffering and wisdom is the final arbiter of family decisions, which is what really matters. And so this traditional understanding of motherhood and wisdom and age made sense because of the similarity to family life. Yet these young women were being told that in order to have power and influence, we should all be the same. But we should all be the same actually means, and this was my experience too, we should all be the same means that if women want to have power, they should act more like men. And a lot of women tell me this, that if you want to have power and you want to have influence, downplay your femininity, act like a man, whatever that means. I have some ideas about what that means. And then you'll be heard. So it was really the students' own questions about this. Then when I developed the course, Jan, it challenged me because I'm a cradle Catholic and my relationship to Mary is intuitive and it's from my childhood. So I figured I'd go read a little bit about the Virgin Mary. Well, my goodness, where do you start? There's 2,000 years of theology on Mary. Like, where do I start? I'll be honest, I didn't know how to think about Mary in the Old Testament and the prophecies of that to the New Testament. I didn't know about the early church debates about the Theotokos, the mother of God. I didn't know what her motherhood meant other than she gave birth to Jesus. I didn't know that it had this spiritual connotation. And then that spiritual connotation wasn't just made up, that it's actually a profound theological point about our nature as human persons and our journey towards God. I didn't know any of that. So what I did was I walked into class with a list of readings. Now, as a professor, for every book you assign, you read 5. So I was reading and I was following other experts and guides, and those included Tim Perry, who had written a book, One Catholic and Evangelical had written on Mary. I followed Pope Benedict XVI for his clarity on a number of doctrinal issues. But I asked students as well to encounter these cultures which have been shaped by devotion to Mary. And I asked students also to, whatever their questions or doubts were, to read a book about a spiritual encounter with Mary, such as Carol Houselander's Read of God or Michael Gately's book on consecration to Mary. And I simply asked them, okay, as we're learning the history and the heritage of Mary and doctrine and devotion, what's touching you? What's moving you? And what does this new knowledge theologically do for your own faith journey? And there, we got some very authentic conversations. I brought in images of Mary and artists talking about images of Mary and then when I did that, I saw that the images themselves, when the ones which I chose, which again were chosen specifically to convey certain heritage about Mary. So the Theotokos, the mother and child, Mary pointing at her child, the seat of wisdom. And when students saw those images, I could see that they were directly impacted by the images and that they were making the connection between doctrine and scripture and actual encountering of Mary in the image, which is what images are supposed to do. They're supposed to be windows for contemplation.
It's really powerful. I mean, what you say, one of the things that really resonate, I think, is that this understanding of the female power and the female authority, I think we can use that word, is, well, it is different, right? And as our society seems to level the differences of the sexes in general, one of the things that happens is it also levels the different qualities of power. And obviously the more, I guess, in a visual society, the more visible elements of power, strength, size, right, kind of weapons, kind of all of that is just applied to the feminine, not understanding that the feminine power, as you described, the Italian grandmother, right, so the moral guide, the wise one, the one that has experience and that is actually holding the family together on the inside, is as impactful as that outside. And that's it's kind of the interesting thing when a family is that the father fights towards the outside and the mother fights towards the inside, but the fighting is obviously not a fighting against the inside, but is rather keeping the adversaries out from the inside. So I think that's a really powerful image. What I find interesting in what you're saying is what you're ultimately doing, though, and what the Virgin Mary serves to then is, in this particular case, is bridge the gap from purely theoretical knowledge and even theoretical theological knowledge to the practical life. And that I find, and I mean, I teach philosophy, but I find that to be so common, that what you learn in class, even for seminarians, is just not seen as applicable to life. And it takes so much time to explain that these changes in philosophy, right, the shift, or let's say, I don't know, like a body-mind dualism, or the shift to a purely utilitarian ethics, that these impact each one of us like every day. And it's really interesting that you had the same experience, but you could bridge this gap by implementing, well, this person, right? And the encounter of that person in art and in theology, right? So that's really...
I think, Jan, I speak a lot to parents of young children. I speak a lot to educators at the K-12 level. And at those levels, there's still more opportunity, I think, to do these holistic kinds of teaching that include the embodied and the experiential. But somehow when we get students in college or graduate degrees in theology and philosophy, it's all in our heads. And I find that it's really important to remember that what I've written about a liberal arts education, the importance there of fostering the imagination all along. It's not like we have our imagination or we have all of our senses, and then suddenly, we age enough and we can just be analytical and memorize texts. But yet this is the way a lot of higher education works. This is not Newman's vision of an education. And this is not the Benedictine view of an education. I think what happened is that it used to be taken for granted that people's imagination was continuously being fed through rich liturgy, through beautiful art and architecture. But yet, so many people encounter theology purely as an academic discipline and haven't encountered the beauty to which these theological ideas, which you've described, give rise to. So if most of the day we live in a mechanized, deconstructed world, not just in terms of ideas, but in terms of images and sounds and architecture, it's going to take time for people to reconnect and to perceive and to experience the beauty of the Christian heritage fully. Yet, what I've done, building on, honestly, we had a conversation about Beethoven. I played 2 minutes of Beethoven during an online seminar, right? I give people, whether they have any devotion to Mary or not, I give people icons of the Virgin Mary. Now, it helps that the icons were made by my husband and I frame them, and so it's a very personal gift. But even just one image a lot of people have none. And so I think throughout education, again, I see more movement, at least in the United States, at reigniting the imagination and creativity using authors like Charlotte Mason, who talks about nature walks and rekindling the awe and the exploration. I think, has a lot of similarities to Aquinas, right? That we first encounter the world through the senses. Now, she also says that, of course, you have to go back into the classroom and teach the principles of science, which go deeper than what you've touched and seen in nature. But again, you're connecting the principles of thinking to the things in the world. And it's that integrative approach. Whereas for so many students, what they live is their experience in the world isn't connected to them, to the principles that they're learning. And so this is why I think in the United States, there's so much eagerness for a return to the liberal arts approach, because it's the undergirding, not just of the humanities, but also of the natural sciences. And so there's a tremendous movement. There's a lot of energy. And I've learned from talking to those parents and to those educators, what I think, for example, Jan, could be done in higher education, in college or in graduate school, is to more explicitly connect a field like philosophy, which you teach, to music and to musicology. We know those connections are there, but they're not taught, right? So what would it look like to have a musicologist co-teach with a philosopher on philosophy and art? Most of the time, the philosophy of art is done by philosophers without, the practicing or the people who really know the inside of music theory and how that relates to philosophy. Or what if, a class on the history of Marian devotion included artists who are making this art today and trying to look at what are the principles we can learn in terms of the meaning of Mary, but also the portrayal of her, right? So is it possible for those of us, myself included, who have this high academic specialization to really open ourselves up to co-teach with people whose specialization is in actually the creation of beautiful art and music? And I think that would be incredibly impactful for students.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I have done that when I taught philosophy of art, and I was in a place where I had artists around. So I was teaching in Rome, and having them come and speak even about the artistic process. So even about how they conceive of, let's say, composition in a painting, or as you say, or like a composition of a musical melody, and how they go about it, is so illuminating for the students, because the artists can really kind of share their way of doing it, and that's where the application actually happens, right? So I I completely agree that this would be a great way of combining and reintegrating the specialized knowledge into the greater whole of education. Now, one of the arguments again, I guess, of critics of bringing back or emphasizing more the liberal arts education that you tackle in your book that I find really fascinating, and I want to kind of perseverate on a little bit here, is the idea that liberal education is actually just an elitist kind of thing. It's for a select few. These texts are not accessible in general. They come out of a certain specific cultural context. They can only be read in the specific cultural context. So by fostering liberal arts education, you actually foster sort of elitism. So what would you respond to that?
Well, I think there's two ways I answer that. One is that liberal arts education, one of the founding principles is that there is such a thing as
Mhm.
excellence in science and in literature and in art. And so those who claim that education can be built without standards of excellence, there are people who make this argument. The question then becomes, if there's no standards about what's good or right or wrong or better, then ultimately you're giving a tremendous amount of authority to the teacher and the bureaucrat to impose what? To impose something purely subjective. I mean, it's kind of an empty argument. So the second question really, I think, is more oriented at, well, the great books curriculums aren't culturally diverse and don't represent me or my culture. And there's two ways to answer that. One thing that makes, in particular in the humanities, makes something excellent is that it is grounded in a particular time and place and experience, but speaks to the universal aspects of the human being. And so to say that Augustine's Confessions is not relevant to students today, but I don't know, a biography of a football star is or something, why is that? Why is something like Augustine's Confessions not universally attractive to young people? And if we only try to give people something that speaks to their experience as they already know it, then that's already an assumption that our experience doesn't have to encounter experiences that are different than us. And how does that help cultural diversity, much less, a coherent identity? It starts to get really, all we're doing is affirming what people already know. With regards to the cultural specificity of the origin of the works, there's plenty of ways to include excellent works from Chinese literature or history, or excellent works from the Islamic tradition. And there are many people who take what is thought of as a core and then expand upon it in ways that make sense for the context in which they're living. But you can't have an infinitely diverse curriculum. You have to have something that's a core, because if it's infinitely diverse, then there's nothing holding it together and there's no coherence to it. And so what I think people, when they say that it's elitist, they say those are some of the concerns, but when you see what has happened in the United States, what you get instead, what I always try to present people with is, okay, well, fine, you don't like liberal arts education. What is the alternative?
Mm.
And in some places, the alternative is a purely technical education only, only skills and credentials. Like, why is that fully human? The other alternative is, as I was saying before, well, we have a lot of cultural diversity, so we're going to talk about cultural diversity all the time. And then in some programs, talking about cultural diversity means that we shouldn't even center reading skills anymore. We should center simply oral skills or drawing skills. Okay, so you want to set up an educational system that intentionally doesn't teach people to read? Why is that good? So, what makes these other forms excellent and reading is not? So it becomes very difficult to have a conversation. So what I tell parents is I say, look, most teachers in most schools really just don't have a coherent philosophy of education. But if you find somebody who does, then I think that's the person you want to be with. What ends up happening, at least in the States, God bless America, we're all about innovation. Boy, we just innovate in the classroom all the time. We innovate the curriculum, we innovate the teaching methods. We create a position for the innovation of the innovations. And then, we measure it. And then guess what? 4 years later, we have a new innovation. We're always innovating here. And I don't think we should imagine the classroom or the lives of young children as a giant laboratory. These children are not little rats that we can set up and experiment and shape them in according to the latest method. Like what? Like really, why is that good? You know? And so what I think we need to do is communicate more forcefully the heritage of what the liberal arts actually is. I do this by lifting up culturally diverse voices that are teaching through the liberal arts, African American women, Latinos, low income families. You don't have to come from the elite culturally, politically, or socially to love these great works of literature and to want to read and to appreciate beauty. And if you look at African American intellectual history, they believed in liberal arts education, they being people like W.E.B. Du Bois. My mother came to the United States from Cuba. What did she want for me? She wanted an excellent education. Why are people coming to America? I do think it's because we still have this fantastic system of education, which, when done well, respects the freedom of the student, involves the parents, presents students with a great heritage of our civilization, and challenges them from that basis to get out and create and innovate. But only once we have laid that foundation of heritage and tradition and virtue can you give students the grounding upon which they need to get out and create and innovate and take risks.
Yeah, no, amazing. And I think actually as if one would do a practical example, or a practical experiment, you will find that what you're saying is correct, which is give people the Confessions by St. Augustine. And no matter where they're from, I think they're going to find something intriguing about it. There's no way. It's like the Sistine Chapel. It's like there's no way. And I've never seen anybody that walks into the Sistine Chapel and is not touched by it. Now, some people may be more touched by it because of certain reasons, where they already like Michelangelo, they really like Renaissance art, or they really like, kind of representational art. That's fine. But even those who don't, they're still touched by it in some way. And because it's that beauty transcends the individual's background, the individual's identity even. And I think that's the same for literature. Truly great literature is truly great, not because somebody called it great, but because everybody reads it. Everybody reads Anna Karenina and says, wow, there is some human tragedy in here that I can link to, right? No matter that it was, never mind that it was written by a Russian in a certain time or period. So I think what you say rings true very much. Now, you talked about the educational system in the States, and obviously this varies a little bit from country to country, but I think something that we can generally say about the West is that the educational system has been, it has been commercialized in a certain sense, right? You have to pay a lot for some universities, especially in the States. Is there still space for an education that emphasizes beauty and contemplation, something that is not really applicable in a technical skill? What would you say to that?
Well, what I see in the United States, the most hopeful thing I see in the United States is the changing landscape of education for children up through the end of high school. There are a lot of low-cost models of this kind of education because the availability of curriculum and online resources has made this kind of education available, for example, in rural areas or to parents who may not be within driving distance of a school. And so actually what's ended up happening is that a lot of the cost of education, understandably, are in buildings and in teachers. But if you have this kind of cooperative approach of a lot of different people in different places collaborating putting out their own resources, knowledge, sharing things, it doesn't have to be super expensive. Now, public schooling in the United States still is free of charge, but there are a lot of ways in which parents who don't have a ton of resources can access this great education. It is by no means limited to people who have economic resources. I would say at the college level, we are now seeing in the United States, because of the rising cost of tuition, people are opting out, or they're opting to go to, again, I think coming from Europe, people don't often realize how many different kinds of colleges we have in the United States. There are state-funded institutions, there's community colleges, and there are increasingly programs that partner with high schools so that when you're 18, you've already finished a year or two of college. The state of Florida is doing this. So state legislators, which fund public schools and also public universities, have an incentive to do this, because if they can make more efficient what they're already funding to get the students the education they need and get them the credential, the degree, there's a lot of stuff, Jan, that happens in education in universities and in high schools that isn't really related to education. So if you're focusing on the essentials, you can focus on the essentials. And then what do the students do in the rest of the time? Well, they might pursue their interest in music or art. They might already be working and learning a trade, or simply learning the skills of running a business because they're working somewhere. So this idea that childhood should be completely protected and idealized and extended until the age of 25, when everybody has done nothing but study academic subjects and get a PhD, like why, right? That might be for a certain subset of student who are the next Erasmuses and Aquinas, God bless them. I might have been one of those kids, but not every kid is like me. And so we need to have an educational system. And here's where I do think the United States excels. Have an educational system that has all different kinds of options, because really, I think in the end, parents know the best what the character of their child is and what their personality is and what the approach should be. Part of the reason these kind of grand experiments don't work is because, as Jacques Maritain says, and Newman, the engine of education is the interior life of the human person who encounters the transcendent and approaches the world with awe and creativity, but also with a personal vocation. And so just as every person shares qualities with other persons, but is also unique, so education has to have some certain common elements to it, but it has got to respect the uniqueness of each person to discover, sometimes with difficulty, to discover what their unique gifts and calling is.
Beautifully said. And Margarita, I think we're coming to a close here. I feel like we have still so many things to talk about, but maybe our conversation can extend anyways beyond the interview, or maybe even into a second interview. But I do want to just end on a practical note, okay? And this is obviously important for me as a parent. Now we have very small children, so it's pertinent, but in a different way. But how would you suggest to parents that ask this, how can they get their child motivated to read? Because that's one of the most basic skills that is needed for any kind of education. And that is, I think, one of the things that many parents struggle most with, at least from what I can see and what I can hear. So what would you say, how can you get your child motivated to read?
Well, I would say two things. What first came into my mind was read with them. But beyond that, I think when a lot of parents struggle in getting their children to read, there might be an emphasis on quantity. I would say go for quality over quantity. And one thing I've been doing, even with my, college students, I have students read and then copy a passage. So having a student read a part of the Confessions or a part of a great novel, pick a passage and have them copy it, maybe even let them use their phone and read it out loud, act it out. So make the experience of reading not just about finishing something, which they should do, but about truly engaging with the text. And so that discipline of copying is part of developing mindful attention. The reading it out loud or the creating a little video where you act it out is a way of engaging with the full person and entering into this, right? And then hopefully over time that will build the love and the discipline to go longer. But listen, Jan, the other thing I will say is to listen to your child. When my friend complained to me that her son wasn't doing his summer reading for his middle school, I just asked him what he had been assigned to read. And it was pretty bad. So I
the
could
child
see
was
why.
reading it. Yes.
It was a real, I'm like, Carrie, you wouldn't want to read this either, really? So don't assume that your child is wrong when they say they're not, what is it they're not interested in reading, and find something that they are interested in reading. So work with your child and understand that what they might be getting assigned in class to read isn't all that, is not a great work of literature. It definitely wasn't for this poor young man.
Yeah. Very good. I think that's a very, very doable thing, and something, a call out anyways to all parents in general. So thank you very much. Well, Margarita, thank you very much for your time. This was very illuminating. I wish you certainly the best with all of your endeavors. I hope to see you again in the summer when you get back here to Oxford. And in the meantime, I think we all have enough homework to read that you've given us now with all of the references. So I feel sometimes I feel very justified if other people also mention books and give the listeners homework. Not just me as a philosopher. So thank you for that. And then we'll be in touch, right? So all the best. Thank you, and I'll speak to you soon.